Came home 3 days early, and I didn't tell her. That's the part people always ask about. Why didn't you call? Why didn't you text? The honest answer is that I wanted to surprise her. We'd been distant for a few months, not fighting, just orbiting. Two people sharing a house and a schedule, and not much else. I thought showing up early, with flowers and a reservation at the Italian place she loved, might crack something open between us. Remind us both of what we used to be. I pulled into the driveway at 9:30 on a Thursday night. The porch light was off, which was odd. My wife always left the porch light on when she was home alone. Said it made the house feel less empty. There was a car parked at the curb I didn't recognize. Dark blue sedan, newer model. I sat in my truck for a moment looking at it, the flowers on the passenger seat starting to droop in the heat. I told myself it was a neighbor's visitor. Someone double parked. Nothing. I let myself in through the side door. The kitchen light was on. There were 2 wine glasses on the counter. The good ones, the crystal ones she only brought out for occasions. A bottle of Malbec on the island, half empty. Her reading glasses folded next to it, which meant she'd been comfortable, settled, not expecting any interruption. I stood there in the dark entryway for a long moment. Then I heard her laugh. That specific laugh, the low one, the real one, not the polite one she used at dinner parties. The one I hadn't heard directed at me in longer than I wanted to admit. It came from upstairs. I set the flowers on the kitchen table. I walked back out the side door. I sat in my truck in my own driveway for 40 minutes, and I didn't make a sound. My name is not important for this. What matters is that I was 51 years old, had been married for 19 years, and I owned a civil engineering firm that kept me on the road more than I liked. My wife. I'll call her my wife, because that's what she was, legally and technically, until she wasn't. Had been a project manager at a logistics company for 11 years. We had one son, 22, finishing his last year at university in another state. We had a house we paid off 2 years early, a dog named Biscuit, and a standing reservation for the first Saturday of every month at the Italian place because the owner knew us by name. By any external measurement, we were fine. I think that's what made it so hard to see, not the affair itself. Affairs have signs, and I recognize now that I'd been turning away from every single one of them for at least a year. It was harder because we weren't unhappy in any dramatic way. We weren't screaming. We weren't sleeping in separate rooms. We were just quiet. And I had told myself that quiet was okay. That quiet was what long marriages look like from the inside. I was wrong about that. I didn't confront her that night. I know that's the part that will bother some people. There's a certain kind of person who reads a story like this and wants the husband to march back inside, throw open the bedroom door, and have it all out right then and there. I understand that impulse. I won't pretend I didn't feel it, but I've spent my career solving structural problems. And the first rule of structural problems is that you don't start tearing out walls until you know exactly what you're dealing with. You assess, you document, you understand the full scope before you touch anything. So I drove to a Marriott, 15 minutes away, paid cash for a room, and I didn't sleep. I lay on top of the hotel bedspread with my shoes still on, and I made myself think clearly about the 2 wine glasses, the car at the curb, her laugh coming from our bedroom. I thought about the last 6 months, the evening she'd stayed late at the office, the weekend conference in Scottsdale she'd attended alone, which I hadn't questioned, because she always traveled for work, the way she'd started going to the gym on Saturday mornings, which I'd been genuinely glad about, because I thought she was taking care of herself. I thought about last month, when she'd suggested we give each other a little space for a while. Her words, and I had nodded like a fool and said, sure, of course, that sounds healthy. I stared at the hotel ceiling and understood that I had been cooperating with my own betrayal for a very long time. I went back to the road the next morning, the job site I was supposed to return to in 4 days, a bridge rehabilitation project outside of Knoxville. I called my site manager and told him I need 3 more days. He didn't ask questions. He never did. I spent those 3 days being methodical. I called a friend of mine, a lawyer I'd known since we were in our 20s, a man who knew how to be discreet, and I told him what I'd seen. He asked me 2 questions. Did I want to save the marriage? And did I have a prenuptial agreement? The answer to the first was that I didn't know yet. The answer to the second was no. He told me to document everything I could before doing anything else. He told me not to move out of the house, not to confront her, not to change anything that might signal to her that something had shifted. He said it the way you'd say it to someone standing on the edge of a very bad financial decision. Carefully, clearly, like the stakes were real. They were. I hired a private investigator the following day, a woman named Well, I won't say her name, but she was recommended by my lawyer. She had 20 years of experience, and she was exactly the kind of person you'd walk past in a grocery store without a second glance. She asked me for a photograph of my wife, the license plate of the blue sedan, and a general schedule of our household. I gave her all three. Then I drove back to Knoxville, and I went back to work. There is something strange about knowing and not saying anything. People who haven't been in that position think it would be unbearable, and I suppose in some ways it was. But there's also a clarity to it. Once you know the truth, everything that felt confusing before suddenly makes sense. All the static resolves. You stop wondering, and there's a cold, quiet kind of peace in that, even when the thing you now understand is terrible. I came home on the scheduled day. Friday evening, she was in the kitchen when I walked in, making pasta, wearing the gray cardigan she always wore around the house in the fall. She turned around and smiled. "You're back." "I'm back," I said. I put my bag down. I kissed her on the cheek. I scratched Biscuit behind the ears when he came skidding across the hardwood floor to greet me. I poured myself a glass of water and asked her how her week had been. She said it had been quiet. I said that was nice. Then I went upstairs, and I unpacked my bag, and I stood in our bedroom for a moment, looking at the bed, at the familiar white quilt, at the nightstand with her book and her reading glasses, and I felt something go very still inside me. Not numb, still, the way a room feels after a long noise finally stops. The investigator sent me her first report 10 days later. I read it in my truck in the parking lot of a hardware store. I read it twice. His name was someone she worked with, not her boss, not a client, a peer, someone who had joined the company 18 months ago. 43 years old, married, 2 kids. The investigator had photographs, timestamps, locations. She had done her job thoroughly. They met on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, usually at his apartment on the east side. On 2 occasions, he had come to our house. Once when I was in Knoxville, once when I was in Baton Rouge. The blue sedan was his. I sat in that parking lot and I didn't cry. I had done my crying already, alone in the Marriott hotel room with my shoes on. This was something different. This was information. This was the full scope of the problem, laid out in front of me with dates and photographs and addresses. I called my lawyer from the parking lot. "I have everything," I said. "Okay," he said. "Now we plan." The planning took 3 weeks. I want to be honest about what that 3 weeks felt like, because I think people imagine it as something cold and calculated, and it wasn't entirely that. There were nights I lay awake and wondered if I'd missed something, some moment where I could have reached for her differently, paid more attention, shown up in the right way. I went back through 19 years in my head the way you audit an old set of accounts, looking for the error that caused everything to go wrong. I don't think I found it. Or maybe the more truthful thing is that I found 100 small things, none of them catastrophic on their own, that had accumulated into a kind of distance neither of us had addressed. I hadn't been present enough. That's probably true, but she had made a choice, a series of deliberate choices, and chosen not to make a different one. Not to say anything to me, not to try. There's a difference between a marriage that died and a marriage that was killed. I spent those 3 weeks figuring out which one I was dealing with. By the end of them, I had my answer. My lawyer had advised me not to change anything financial before we were ready to file, and I followed that advice. But there are things a man can do quietly that are entirely within his rights. I moved certain documents, insurance records, investment statements, the deed to the property I owned separately before we were married, to my office. I updated the contact information on my personal accounts. I had a private conversation with our financial advisor, a man I'd worked with for 12 years, who looked at me across his desk with something careful in his expression and said, "Is this heading where I think it's heading?" I told him I wasn't sure yet, but I wanted to be prepared. He said he understood, and he began a quiet accounting. My son came home for a long weekend in the middle of all this. He's a good young man, thoughtful, observant, a little too perceptive for anyone's comfort, including mine. He noticed something within 6 hours of walking through the door, though he couldn't have named what it was. We were sitting on the back porch the second evening, after dinner, after his mother had gone inside. The sky was doing that October thing where it goes from orange to dark blue in about 15 minutes, and he was nursing a beer and looking at the tree line. He said, without looking at me, "You okay, Dad?" I said, "Why do you ask?" He shrugged. "You two seem like you're being careful with each other." Careful. I thought that was an extraordinarily precise word for what he'd observed. I told him that his mother and I were going through something, and that we were handling it, and that none of it had anything to do with him, and none of it changed anything important. He looked at me for a long moment, that direct look he's had since he was about 8 years old, and then he nodded once. "Okay," he said. "I'll tell you more when there's more to tell," I said. "Okay," he said again, and then we sat there until it was full dark, and he talked about his thesis, and I listened, and that was the best hour I had in a very long time. I confronted her on a Tuesday, not because Tuesday was significant, because I was ready on a Tuesday, and I had learned in 51 years of life that once you are ready to do something difficult, you don't wait for a better day. She came home at 6:30, normal time. I had made dinner. Nothing elaborate, just the roast chicken I've been making since before we were married, the one she used to say she could smell from the driveway. The table was set. The kitchen was clean. She looked around when she came in, a little wary, the way people get when something familiar is slightly off. "You cooked," she said. "Sit down," I said. She sat. I put the food on the table, and I sat across from her, and I looked at her for a moment, really looked at her, in a way I probably hadn't in years. And then I opened the folder my lawyer had prepared, and I slid it across the table. She looked down at it. She looked back up at me. "I know about him," I said. "I know about Tuesday nights and Thursday nights and the 2 times he was in this house. I know his name, and I know his wife's name, and I know he has 2 children." I kept my voice level. "I had practiced this in the car. I'm not here to fight with you. I'm not here to ask you to explain yourself or beg me for anything. I'm here to tell you that I know, and that I've already spoken to an attorney, and that I need you to understand that everything that happens next will go considerably better for both of us if you're honest with me from this point forward." She was very still, the way a person gets when the ground has dropped out from under them, and they haven't quite registered the falling yet. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Long enough. The night you came home early." I didn't answer that. She put her hands flat on the table. She looked at them. "I'm sorry," she said. And I believe she meant it, in whatever partial way a person means something like that, in a moment like that. Not sorry she'd done it, maybe. Sorry she'd been found. Sorry for the look on my face. Sorry for the look on my face. Sorry for the folder on the table. Something. "I know you are," I said. "That doesn't change where we're going." She cried eventually. Not right then. Right then she was in shock, I think. But later that night, after we had sat through the most excruciating meal of my life, after she had moved into the guest room without me asking her to, I was lying in our bed, my bed, and I heard her through the wall. Not loud, just that quiet kind of crying that's almost worse than the loud kind because it means a person is trying to keep it inside. I lay there and I listened, and I did not go to the door. Not because I didn't care that she was in pain, but because her pain was not, in that moment, mine to fix. The divorce took 8 months. It was not acrimonious, which I credit partly to the preparation and partly to the fact that she knew I knew everything, and that left very little room for her to perform. We divided things according to what was fair and what was documented. The house sold in the spring. I got an apartment near my office, smaller than I expected to like, but I find I sleep better in it than I have in years. Biscuit lives with me. That was the only thing I was inflexible about. She has not, to my knowledge, stayed with the man she was seeing. I heard from a mutual friend that his wife found out. I did not engineer that. I want to be clear about that. I made no calls, sent no emails. Some consequences arranged themselves. I want to say one thing about forgiveness, because people always ask. I've thought about it. I think about it occasionally, the way you think about a house you used to live in. Not with urgency, but sometimes when something reminds you of it. I don't carry what happened as a wound anymore. It feels more like a scar, which is different. Scars don't hurt. They're just evidence of something that happened and healed. I don't think I'm angry. I'm not sure I'm fully forgiven her, if forgiveness means what most people seem to mean by it. But I'm not waiting for anything from her either. I closed that account. What I know is this. I spent 19 years being not quite present enough, not quite brave enough to say out loud when something between us had gone quiet for too long. And she spent at least 2 of those years making choices that she should have brought to me instead. We were both, in our different ways, operating on avoidance. I won't do that again. Not with anyone. My son came to help me move into the apartment. He drove 3 hours on a Saturday, showed up with coffee and without questions, and spent 6 hours hauling boxes up 2 flights of stairs with me. At the end of it, we ordered pizza and sat on the floor because I didn't have a couch yet. And he looked around at the bare walls and the stacked boxes and said, "You know, it's not bad." "No," I said. "It's actually not." He looked at me the way he looks at things he's trying to figure out. "You seem okay, Dad." "I am okay," I said. "And the thing is, I meant it. Not the way you mean it when you're trying to convince someone. The way you mean it when you're done something hard and come out on the other side and discovered that the other side is livable. Not what you imagined. Not what you planned. Not the life you built with someone over 19 years. But livable, and in some ways more honest than anything I'd had in a long time." Biscuit had found a patch of evening sun on the floor near the window. He was asleep, twitching a little, dreaming about something. I thought, I did not make a scene. I did not beg. I did not burn anything down. I found out the truth, and I handled it. And now I'm here. That's enough. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually went wrong. Not the affair. The affair was a symptom. I mean, what went wrong before that? In the years when everything looked fine from the outside, neither of us was honest enough to say that something was quietly going hollow on the inside. I think about the man I was for most of those 19 years. Competent at work, reliable, present enough at home to not be accused of absence, but not present enough to really notice what was slipping. I told myself that a quiet marriage was a mature marriage. I told myself that the distance between us was just what happened when two busy people shared a life. I was wrong, and the cost of being wrong about that was steep. Here's what I've come to understand. The choices we avoid don't disappear. They compound. Every conversation I didn't have with my wife about the growing distance between us was a small debt I was taking on without realizing it. And she was doing the same, in her own way, avoiding the harder conversation, choosing the easier exit. By the time I was standing in my own kitchen, looking at 2 wine glasses that weren't mine to explain, 19 years of small avoidances had accumulated into something neither of us could fix anymore. That's the part no one talks about in these stories. It's not just the person who cheated who made a series of choices. It's both people, over a long time, choosing the comfortable silence over the difficult truth. I'm not excusing what she did. What she did was a betrayal, and it ended our marriage. And those are facts. But I'd be lying if I said I walked away from 19 years with clean hands. I walked away with the knowledge that I had let things go quiet when I should have said something. For longer than I should have said something. For longer than I should have. What saved me, in the end, wasn't anger. It was clarity. The moment I decided to stop reacting and start thinking, to assess before I acted, to understand the full scope before I moved, I stopped being a victim of what was happening and started being someone who was handling it. That shift, from reactive to deliberate, is the thing I'm most proud of in all of it. Not the outcome. The way I conducted myself getting there. I've thought about what I'd tell someone, standing where I was standing that night, in the driveway, looking at a car that shouldn't have been there. I'd tell them, don't let the pain make the decisions. Pain is loud and it wants to be in charge, and it will burn everything down if you let it. But pain is not wisdom. Steadiness is wisdom. Doing the hard thing carefully, with your eyes open, knowing exactly what you're dealing with. That's the only way through something like this that you won't regret later. My son helped me move into my apartment on a Saturday in November. We ate pizza on the floor. Biscuit found a patch of sun and went to sleep. And I looked around at that small, bare, quiet space and thought, this is honest. This is real. Whatever comes next, it starts from something true. That's more than I had before. And it turns out, it's enough.